So hello and welcome to this, the third in our three-part webinar series. In this webinar, I'm going to talk about how we can make spaces better naturally and literally grow value. I love talking about this sort of thing because it's full of opportunities to have positive impacts on the environment, on people, and as I hope to demonstrate today, on business too. So it's the classic win-win-win. If you have any questions as I go through this webinar, please do put them in the chat or the Q&A, either will do, and Jess will ask me them at the end. I want to start by just recalling a quick story. Several years ago, I was invited in to speak to the UK CEO of one of the world's largest out-of-home advertising companies. The meeting was booked for an hour, but I was told by my contact in the company that the CEO was famed for closing meetings after 5 minutes if he thought it was wasting his time. Harsh maybe, but understandable. This particular company had an excellent sustainability policy, except for the one fact that, as per many other sustainability policies, it only spoke about how they were reducing their impacts on the environment. So my opening gambit was to talk about how we could help them to incorporate natural features and make positive impacts on some of their portfolio sites. And I went on to suggest that this should become a declared policy for them to have positive impacts on the environment. The idea passed muster. We talked about it for the full hour. And to this day, we're still working with that company, helping them to make some of their spaces better naturally. So just a quick intro. My name is Richard Sabin. For those of you who don't know me, I head up what we do at Biotecture. Biotecture are green infrastructure specialists. I co-founded the company in 2007 with the vision of transforming urban landscapes. And we're proud to now be a specialist business within Mighty Landscapes and the wider Mighty PLC group. As such, we can deliver more for our clients, backed up by a determined group-wide stated commitment on sustainability. In the first of this webinar series, we presented kind of a Green Wall 101 on the what, the why, and the where for living walls, as well as looking into their history, options available, and the demonstrable value they can bring. In the second webinar, we look specifically at the opportunities of cladding buildings in plants, like this one that you see on the screen at 1 to 5 Bank Street in Canary Wharf, including going into some of the detail on the processes we go through, right from design through greenhouse works to construction and long-term maintenance, as well as covering off in detail the compliance challenges. This second webinar was about cladding, mostly new build, but also some retrofit. This third webinar will look at how we can enhance and enrich existing spaces in commercial places like public realm and office environments. And I'm going to do this through 3 lenses in turn, which I'm calling environmental net gain, people net gain, business net gain. Again, the classic win-win-win. Throughout, I'm going to demonstrate with practical examples, images, and snippets of videos. But my central message is going to be about the holistic potential for green infrastructure to make spaces better naturally. But first, a quick reminder of the challenges we face and of what we mean by green infrastructure. So there's some pretty serious statistics on the screen here in terms of where we are at the moment. And where we work, which is in the ultra-urban zone, the stat on the left-hand side about the built environment accounting for 39% of all global CO2 emissions, far higher than any other individual sector, I think is really important. And I think of real relevance to this webinar about making spaces better is the fact that 80% of the buildings that will be in use in 2050 already exist. And I'm sure that's the same for many public realm spaces. And so what we need to do is start to think about what we can do with those existing spaces, as well as thinking around the new builds. And I'm going to cover off some of these issues when I look particularly at the environmental net gains. And I think from an air pollution point of view and a rising temperatures point of view, I think that there's some real challenges that we're going to face over the next few years. And making spaces better through green infrastructure and nature-based solutions is really going to help with this. And again, just a reminder of why green infrastructure is so powerful and the holistic challenges worldwide. Green infrastructure provides holistic solutions to some of the environmental challenges that exist. And so we look at these benefits that cut across the whole idea of planet, environmental net gain, people net gain, and business net gain. And across these, we're going to be looking at certain areas and places and spaces where we can work this. So again, this is from the Arab Cities Alive document. I present this all the time because I think it's brilliant in terms of disclosing where green infrastructure can be in the ultra urban zone. And so just to recap on this, we have rooftop areas like green roofs or podium slabs. We have small pocket park gardens or linear park gardens. We then have the vertical green infrastructure where bioarchitecture started. And fourthly, we have the indoor space environment. And I'm going to talk a lot about the indoor space environment as well. So examples of green infrastructure. Externally, we can show different examples for different reasons, whether that's visual enhancement, whether it's for sustainable urban drainage solutions, biodiversity, etc., etc. There are many different ways in which we can do that. But it's not just outside. Biophilic design really comes to the fore when we come inside. I read a statistic recently that says the average person in Britain spends just 8% of their time outside on a working day or a weekday. I think that's extraordinary. If the average person spends 8%, a lot of those of us who spend our time in offices and working from home or whatever, possibly rarely go outside during the working week. So bringing the outside in and reconnecting people with nature is really, really important. There are many, many ways we can do that. So moving on to this whole idea of environmental net gain, people net gain, and business net gain. I really need to touch on this idea of weak or strong sustainability. On the left-hand side, we have the three pillars of sustainability, often thought of as a three-legged stool. And what we're looking for is that sweet spot in the middle where it's good for business, it's good for society, and it's good for the planet as well. This model has inherent weaknesses to it. First of all, it's not reflective of what actually happens within reality. It's not reflective of how we live within society on this planet. The planet has boundaries. And so when you start to look at the strong sustainability model, economics is then nestled within society. So the economy is to be good for people, and people need to exist within a viable planet environment. And this model of strong sustainability therefore puts a hierarchical impact on how we make decisions. It says that if something is good for the environment, then we can start to consider if it's good for people. And if something is good for people, only then should we be considering if it's good for business as well. And then we can have a flourishing business. And so at Bioarchitecture, we look at this in this kind of order of providing healthy spaces. If we can provide healthy spaces, whether that's for customers, whether that's for staff, we will then have enriched people with all the benefits that come from that. And when we have healthy spaces that we've created for enriched people, we then can have a flourishing business. And I think as we start to cross some of the planetary boundaries at the moment in the last 20 or 30 years, or particularly in this decade, we're starting to see the real impacts of weak sustainability solutions, where we consider that some business solutions are equally as important as society and the environment. And that's not a great recipe for our long-term future on a viable biosphere within the planet. So I'm going to talk you through now in terms of using nature to make spaces better. I'm going to talk through in this order how we can start to think about and some of the things we need to consider to create healthy spaces that will then lead to enriched people, that then comes on to flourishing businesses, and some of the benefits that come into each of those and the returns on investment. So when we talk about environmental net gain, we're talking about so many of this is interlinked. What we talk about that's good for our environment, and often we think about saving the planet. Actually, the planet will be fine. It's about saving a viable planet that's fit for human beings to live on. And I think that's a really interesting distinction, because we are not just about saving the planet. We need to talk about robustly saving the environment in which we live in, or which we depend upon. And so when we start to think about some of the potential benefits that we can have through green infrastructure, I've put 6 kind of benefits up on the screen. There are a few more, but these are kind of the 6 major ones. And we've got a lot of statistics and details about a number of these. I'm going to cover off 3 of them, the highlighted ones that are there, just as some examples. But throughout, whenever we talk about benefits here, all of these are interlinked. Very much like the holistic solutions that we're trying to provide through green infrastructure, things that benefit the environment also benefit people and will also benefit a business as well. And hopefully I can demonstrate that as we go on. And so what we're looking at is positive impacts as more greeneries make cities more livable. And then plants, when people can see them, it lowers their blood pressure and stress, which leads to increased creativity and productivity, which then is good for business. So this is the way this is going to kind of go. But I'm going to try and encapsulate it within the 3 elements. So in terms of environmental net gain, when we talk about biodiversity habitats, when we introduce green infrastructure, we know from science studies, for example, that if you put a green wall on a brick wall, you are effectively increasing biodiversity simply by adding the plants in, but also in terms of species that would come and visit that space. A brick wall is likely to have 100 square meter brick wall is likely to have approximately 4 species of spider somewhere on that wall. 100 square meters of living wall is likely to have 19 or 20 species of spider somewhere on that living wall. And that goes up and down the food chain in terms of how that gets added in. And not only the plants do that, but we can also start to integrate bug hotels into these spaces as well. So we can start to tap into a network of greening spaces. Moving on to creating cleaner air zones. At a global scale, nature and plants provide the perfect cocktail of air for us to breathe in our lungs. It's only at the local level that we mess with that air quality with some of our mega city practices and pollution episodes that happen. And so this is hopefully a very obvious example of a construction site hoarding in Farringdon in London. You can see the picture on the left, the before picture, and you can see how we've used nature to make that space better. And it's actually on the side of the cycle superhighway in London. So really important that we're creating creating an atmosphere where the plants can create cleaner air zones in that space. There's a lot of data on the ability of plants, both through physical, chemical and biological processes, to reduce air pollution locally. The CO2 sequestration benefit of plants is huge, but within cities where the pressure from the environmental issues is probably more local around air pollution than it is about CO2. When we come out of the city, or when we come to the edge of cities and we start to think about some of the traffic ways and the ways in which we can do that, ways in which we can mitigate for that with green infrastructure. This is in Southampton. This is Millbrook Roundabout. It's the roundabout that's most used in the country by HGV lorries with containers on the back, because the dock gate for that is just off to the left of this picture. And so the living walls were installed for the NOx and the TOX, for the toxic gases and the particulate matter, to capture those, but also, again, part of this holistic nature of green infrastructure to beautify the space. And a very quick case study on the ability of plants to reduce air pollution within spaces, particularly very locally, would be a project that we worked on, Biotecture, construction-wise, back in 2011. So this is the existing building in 2011 on the side of the Bakerloo line of Edgware Road tube station. And we clad it with a living wall. And we used 15 different species, and we tested those species. We worked with the Air Pollution Reduction in London group, Air Pollution Research in London group, to test each species for its ability to reduce particulate matter, in this instance, particularly PM10s. And one of the things that Boris commissioned this wall when he was mayor of London, and one of the things that he's correctly identified here is the double benefit of not only reducing air pollution, but also beautifying this spot. And I want to share a real quick snippet of a video that just shows how it's not only doing the air pollution reduction and beautifying the spot, but it's also adding to the biodiversity. So on the flyover there, you can see the traffic that is there, that the living wall is there to capture the air pollution from. Our maintenance guys who took this video also get all sorts of people coming up to them saying they go out of their way to walk past living walls like this, just because it adds value to their day. And it's obviously adding value to the bees as well, in terms of how that sits as well. That's biodiversity and air pollution. The third one I just want to pick up on of the 6 or 7 benefits from an environmental net gain is temperature. We all know that plants provide shading and cooling, but we often ignore the impact that they give us. And our climate is changing, and our approach to how we mitigate for that climate changing needs to change and adapt with it. And I think it needs to change really quite quickly. There's a lot of data around the world, and I often refer to this slide because I find it really worrying, given that we're in 2023, coming towards the end of that now. So we're 26 years away from 77% of the world's cities experiencing a striking change in climate. One of the interesting stats on here, I think, is that 22% of the 520 cities mapped or globally modelled is that they will experience novel climate conditions, things they've never experienced before. London, for example, experiencing 40-degree heat last year and is likely to experience 45-degree heat. So the climate modelers will tell us some point in the next 10 years, how are we equipped to deal with that? And this is where making spaces better naturally from an environmental point of view can really help. An example of that would be this project we worked on in Southampton Row in Holborn, where you can see from the thermal imaging on the right hand side, you've got a west facing living wall. On the right hand side, you've got sun acting upon the living wall and on the building next door. The building next door's coming into the 40 degrees, whereas the living wall's down in the 20s still. Now, if we can develop and do this at scale, that will have thermal benefits, not only for the building, which means reduced primary energy, because less air conditioning costs will be required, but it can also start to have an impact on the urban heat island effect because of less reflected heat coming back out into spaces. That has then, in turn, an effect on the number of people who are suffering asthma attacks or heart attacks, which in turn reduces the burden on the NHS. So as a society, for us to start thinking about how we react to climate change in the next 10 years is actually really important. And I believe that green infrastructure has a huge part to play in this. So from an environmental net gain, we move on to people net gain. This is probably one of my favourite photos of people enjoying natural environment. This is obviously the New York High Line, nothing to do with us in terms of design or development, but it really does show the draw of nature, and it shows how interlinked this all is. That space is going to be slightly cooler because the plants are there. That space is offering shading, it's offering views of nature, the ability to walk through. It's going to be evocative, it's going to be offering some smells up, it's going to be offering, all of that space that makes us feel better within ourselves. And people net gain is really, really important. We need to create spaces that are good for people if we're going to have good business, whether that's for staff or whether that's for customers. Encouraging people into our places and spaces, particularly post-pandemic, is really important. And bringing nature into those spaces can really help us to do that. Stats like this just speak for themselves, and we all know that what we do within our week is we compartmentalize. As I said earlier, we spend on average 92% of our time indoors during the working week, and then at weekends we tend to escape to the country, we garden, we go out into nature. What we want to do by making spaces better naturally is to rebalance that working week, to bring nature into our cities, to bring it into our eye lines, to, as JCDecaux would say, the advertising company, talking about dwell time. We want people to be able to dwell in and on plants. And the reason is that people like plants. And this can be a business benefit, but I've put this in the people benefit section. In December 2022 and January 23, we carried out a survey of 2,000 people. We wanted to see what would happen if we could turn Blue Monday green. So Blue Monday is the day in the year when there's a population we feel are most oppressed. And so we wanted to turn Blue Monday green. And we got some great testimonies back from people about having plants and being in nature. 78% of people say that being around greenery improves their mental well-being. And these are important stats when we start to come further on in this webinar towards the business net gain, because we want our people to be engaged. We want our people to be enthused. We want to talk about presenteeism rather than just reduced absenteeism. And so when we talk about reconnecting people with nature, there are a whole bunch of benefits in terms of people net gain. I'm going to just again pick out 3 of these. So first of all, better air quality. Clearly, it's better for people to have better air quality. It's also good for people to perceive that they've been given spaces that have better air quality as well. Even that perception lifts mood. And by lifting people's mood, again, we have enriched people. And that's good enough in its own. But in terms of from a business point of view, the more enriched and engaged people are, the more they're likely to stay, and the more they're likely to add in value to that business. And it's the same with retail spaces too. And the second reason I want to go through is this idea of attention restoration. So attention restoration is about rebalancing through our relationship with natural materials. There was an article in the Atlantic magazine a few years ago, and it put it perfectly. So I'm just going to read that out. Nature restores mental functioning in the same way that food and water restores bodies. The business of everyday life, dodging traffic, making decisions and judgment calls, interacting with strangers, answering emails, is depleting. And what man-made environments take away from us, nature gives back. There's something mystical and you might say unscientific about this claim, but its heart actually rests in what psychologists call attention restoration theory. According to attention restoration theory, urban environments are draining because they force us to direct our attention to specific tasks, e.g. avoiding the onslaught of traffic, and grab our attention dynamically, compelling us to look here before telling us to look over here. These demands are draining, and they're also absent in natural environments. Forests, streams, rivers, lakes, plants, oceans demand very little from us. Though they're still engaging, ever-changing, and attention-grabbing. The difference between natural and urban landscapes is that how they command our attention. While man-made landscapes bombard us with stimulation, their natural counterparts give us the chance to think as much or as little as we would like, and the opportunity to replenish exhausted mental resources. So I really like that description of how it works. And the attention restoration theory was developed by a guy called Stephen Kaplan. And this image, which is at Heathrow Airport, really captures this for me. On the right-hand side, you've got something that's 50 meters away, and it says something about it needs to take a minute to get there. And there's a tannoy and various other bits and pieces going on. On the left-hand side of the image, you've got some plants where you can just stare into the fractal forms. And there's no straight lines in there. There's nothing to really sort of grab you. You can get lost in there. And because our DNA is so wrapped up in biology, getting lost in that space allows us to then become more productive and creative and to feel better in terms of our well-being. And the third one that I do believe is a people benefit is better acoustics. There's nothing worse than sitting and trying to have a meeting in a space where the sound is endlessly bouncing off and echoing. It gives you headaches. And again, the return on investment is that for businesses, that then takes forward into people who are more engaged because of that space. So green wall systems, for example, have proven acoustic barriers potential, and so in spaces where spaces at premium, both literally and physically, we can add in green wall systems, for example, that will not only be acoustic barriers, but will also provide that thought of well-being as well. So that's people net gain. Moving on into business net gain, I'm going to put exactly the same photo up again when we talk about staff retention, which I think is a huge part of what we're looking to do in terms of business net gain. And this stat that 94% of staff view their working environment as a reflection of how they're valued as employees. It goes on to say that 39% of people don't believe that their employers take this into account. And so there's areas of dissatisfaction around that. And I think staff retention is huge. And you can think about the return on investment that comes from reduced recruitment costs. But also, when you have teams who've been with you for a long time, the productivity increases because you understand the processes, you understand each other, and how that moves forwards. So staff retention and creating really nice environments for staff is a really good idea. So I'm going to start with business net gain by looking outside, and then we're going to move inside. So what is the value to business of making spaces better naturally? Well, there's a few examples that would show this. Hopefully this example on screen draws you towards the right, draws you towards the cafe and the green space and the blue space that's in there in terms of where you would prefer to be. And therefore footfall will be higher, and therefore rents charged can be higher. A really good example for me is going to see a company called MacArthur Glen and their designer retail outlet site in Roosendaal in Holland. And this is an image of it as it exists. And we do a lot of work with MacArthur Glen. We've worked with them in the UK, we've worked with them in France, and this is our first project with them in Holland. And what they wanted us to do is they've got a beautiful centre here, lots of landscaping, lots of places for people to sit down, lots of shaded areas. And they wanted us to increase the amount of greening space by adding into where these black areas are on the side, by planting all of these up and down through the centre. So they're taking an existing really good looking site and increasing the amount of greenery. And why are they doing that? They're doing that because they want to increase even more the feeling of people coming into a natural space. With all of MacArthur Glen's designer outlet sites, all of the rentals are charged on footfall. So if they can increase the footfall by providing multiple opportunities for people to come in, and also planting that perhaps will change seasonally, then that can increase the amount of rents that they can charge. So from a business point of view, it makes good business sense. I was there on a Friday, probably about September. On a Saturday morning, I came back to the UK, went to my hometown of Chichester and went to the gym. And this is Chichester Gate. It's a very inhospitable place. There's nowhere to sit down. There's very little shading. A lot of the shop or retail units here are unoccupied at the moment. And I imagine that the rents that they're able to charge in this space, even for the occupied units, are much less than MacArthur Glen can charge, simply because the landscape's not there. Now, this is a site, I'm not naming names here, but this is a site that's managed by JLL. And the reason I want to mention JLL is that I was giving a webinar or a talk directly up at their Canary Wharf offices last Thursday on making spaces better. And there were approximately 100 sustainability professionals in the room. And it was really engaging and encouraging to see the enthusiasm of mostly younger professionals wanting to do something to make a positive impact on the world. And I reminded them when I started in sustainability maybe 20 years ago, there probably weren't even 100 sustainability professionals in the whole of London. And here there were 100 of them talking. I was talking to over 100 of them in the same room from the same firm. So hopefully someone will get the message about Chichester City Gate, and the next time I go to the gym, it will be a wonderful oasis that I can go to. As an inspirational example, I want to go through just Belcourt Shopping Centre here, which is in Stratford upon Avon. that's the existing. That's how it all started, with a car park that's next to a shopping centre, and we in 2016 put green wall onto that car park and onto the side wall, which was part of the side of the cafe wall space as well. And so it's linking the shopping centre through to the car park. And a more recent photo which showed just the benefits of how that green space is giving a green hug to people. And so externally, we look at opportunities for placemaking and wayfinding. By making spaces better, we naturally can really encourage people to come into those places and spaces. This is a little pop-up event that was put up in King's Cross, but could equally be a permanent space. And we tend to find that wherever green is installed, people gravitate towards it. So if we put green walls on a cafe, the tables that people come to sit at are the ones that are nearest the green, because they like that green hug idea and they like being reconnected with nature. Ways in which we can start to think about doing this are, just with some of the ancillary spaces around. Imagine that was an electrical substation in behind that space there. You can hide it off and screen it off. Imagine you've got cycle shelters you want to be putting in. Well, let's not just put some hoops in. Let's actually increase the biodiversity that's in there. You could put green walls on the side of this as well, but we've got a green roof. We're reconnecting with nature, and by showing that business net gain of really thinking about the environmental benefits or the natural benefits of some of the ancillary buildings we're putting up, we're actually enriching those spaces and giving our people real encouragement as to what we're doing and how we are demonstrating our commitment to the environment, as well as matching their commitment to the environment. Some other ways that we're looking to do this at Biotecture at the moment is with some urban parklets. We've noticed that a lot of public realm spaces, a bit like the one I showed you in Chichester, have a lot of open space. A lot of open piazzas have space which we hurry across as humans. We don't tend to stop in them, and therefore there's no potential for that public realm space to be of a flourishing business benefit. So if we can just drop some urban parklets into these spaces, then this is something that we can start to encourage people to come into. Then you can imagine a coffee bar coming into this space. You can imagine some street art, just basically bringing some of our piazzas and city town centres back to life, but not necessarily fixing to buildings. And these urban parklets can even be forkliftable, so they can be moved around as and when needed. But we're really starting to get some real interest, both at commercial office size, but also starting to look in the public realm and from local authorities at how we can use these urban parklets to really encourage people to come back into spaces and to stay in those spaces rather than just using them as crossing zones. Here's an example of an urban parklet this is at Canary Wharf. And as you can see, it's being really nicely used. It's got a green wall background, and people, rather than walking through, are spending time stopping, having a chat, being out in nature, meeting up with people, and it's all encouraged. It's right next to the Elizabeth line. It's all encouraging people to come back into that space. And Canary Wharf is somewhere that we have worked extensively over the last two years or so. And we often cite it as a case study, but one thing we've not shown before in any webinar is a before and after video. So I'm just going to play this before and after video of what we did at Canary Wharf. And I think for us, in terms of making spaces better, the before and after imagery is, well, it speaks for itself. We're really focusing on the entranceways at Canary Wharf, the gateways to the space where people come and go. It's of making spaces better, and how the green makes such a difference to that environment. Canary Wharf really recognised their wish to move from a 5-day-a-week workspace into a 7-day-a-week work, rest, recreate, and live shop space. And you've got right opposite the living walls we're putting in here is the Elizabeth line, so the opening of the Elizabeth line. So for them, this was all about placemaking and wayfinding. And again, there's that pocket park just being used down the bottom while people are, able to really get up close with the plants and have that sort of benefit. My belief is that having nature around people actually intuitively or subconsciously gives us that benefit in the same way that really good architecture gives us a benefit. We just don't notice it sometimes, but we do notice when things are more negative sometimes. So again, a bit like the service station, this is now moving inside internally. Instead of the service station, which of these offices would you prefer to be in? It's the same office, but on the left, it's making the space better with nature. And it was a very hot, dry light. The brightness of the light was ridiculous, and the noise would bounce off of this space. This is Centrica's head office is in Windsor. The windows upstairs are the trading floor. The space downstairs comes off of their CPD rooms where they have meetings of 100+ people. And they'd spill out into this space at coffee time, and it'd be like a cacophony of noise that would come. Instant headache material. What we did was, as part of a refurb in there, we added the green wall on the south-facing elevation, which then took away a lot of the heat and a lot of the light, and it also absorbed the noise as it bounces back. And suddenly you've got a space in which you can work. Suddenly you've got a productive space. So from a business net gain point of view, creating these sort of places and spaces where people want to be and are happy being. And in that new environment, you've also got the introduction of the timber as well, which is a biophilic element. So again, we're next to those natural materials. When we come inside, I just want to run through some of the benefits for an internal space. In many ways, internally, the benefits are much easier to capture. There are fewer variables, and so we can rely on the data in terms of the benefits of adding nature into spaces. And the benefits that come from the science studies are pretty consistent, and I think they're pretty remarkable. And this idea of the fact that we can, by enriching a space with plants, and the rule of thumb is if you've got a view of more than 10 plants from your desk, you will be more productive and creative than if you haven't. And so if you think about your environment where you are, can you see, and it includes looking out the window, that's fine. Can you see 10 plants or more? If you can, you will be more productive and more creative. How did they work this one out? Well, this is a study that was carried out by the man in the lab coat, which is Dr. Craig Knight. And he's looking at the benefits of lean versus green in terms of office spaces. And he's got a whole bunch of things down the center of this table, which are vessels to contain liquid. And you put them in order of size of what you think they are. And then there's a bit of creativity around use of different materials. We'll do that in an environment with no plants in it. Then we'll surround people with plants and do the experiment again with different groups of people, obviously. But carried out multiple times, and it's about 12%. The increase in accuracy of putting those vessels in the right place when surrounded by plants is about 12%, which is hugely significant. But people don't believe it. But let's do another one. This is a really simple one at the University of Washington in the US. Essentially what happened was they put you in front of a computer screen, and on the screen will come up a symbol, a circle, a square, or a triangle, and you have to press a button to match the symbol that's come up on the screen as fast as you possibly can to it coming up. They do that in an environment with no plants in it. Then they do it in environments surrounding with plants. Again, 12% quicker reactions on the computer task. And people were less stressed. There was no significant change in whether they got it right or got it wrong. There was a low percentage of people who obviously got it wrong because you pressed the wrong button. So there's no change in that percentage, but the percentage in correct answers being tapped onto the screen was 12% faster in a room full of plants. And this is just text on a screen, and I get that, but this is a really interesting study from my point of view. This is about filming a group of students, which could be a group of people working in an office, in terms of their reaction to a lecture when they're in a planted room and when they're in a non-planted room. And they were kind of observed for signs of inattentiveness. And results showed that in the planted room, students' inattentiveness was reduced by 70%. Now imagine if you're sitting in a meeting and your inattentiveness is reduced by 70%, how much benefit that's going to have from a business net gain point of view. And so what can we do? Well, we can start to, from an air pollution reduction point of view, from a better acoustics point of view, from a reducing inattentiveness point of view, from a presenteeism rather than absenteeism point of view, we can start to introduce some green into these spaces. And again, inside living walls, we can add it because space, again, inside offices is at a premium, both literally and financially. Living walls don't take up much space. So we can do this with projects. We can do this with products. We can start to do modular products that could go in different spaces to give people a view of plants. We've even got plants that move on wheels to create, agile offices. So you can sit by these plants and you can have the acoustic benefit, you can have the screening benefit, the privacy and the security benefit. Then you can move them if you want to create a slightly bigger space. So having plants around us and having mobile plants around us is becoming really interesting. There's an example of a static living wall, but this is an example in London of a flourish unit that we would put in there that can flourish. And again, looking at the urban parklets that we were looking at, they're not only necessary for the outdoor realm, particularly within retail spaces, they could be for the indoor realm as well, providing spaces where people can sit, maybe restore themselves a little bit, have a cup of coffee, and then go shopping again. Whereas the space on the left has nowhere for people to sit down. When they get tired, they go home. Whereas if we can give them a space where they can sit and recuperate, then that's going to be good for that business or good for the overall site. And again, going back to the MacArthur Glen model of footfall driving rents, this is something they've recognised massively. And so the idea of creating spaces where people can sit in nature and then return to whatever it is they're doing as staff, whether it's their work or as customers, whether it's in the retail environment or whatever it might be. And so just as I conclude, I'm going, before any questions, I'm just going to go through one more case study, which for me is quite a compelling one for some work we did in Heathrow Airport in terms of business net gain. So I've shown this one before, but I don't think we've shown the video for some time. So I'm going to show the video of how we put this one together because I think that's of interest. This is a non-space. This is Gate 25, Terminal 3, Heathrow Airport, and it has no access to natural light, what psychologists call a non-space. It could be anywhere in the world. And so all airports are scored on the same rating, so they can sort of score themselves against each other in terms of quality of their spaces. And this was the third worst performing gate in all of Heathrow Airport. And so what we did was we worked with them to create what we call the garden gate. And obviously being indoors with no access to natural light, we're adding in some LED lights to do various bits and pieces. Two things I would pick out of this one. One is that the planting itself is really adding into the environment. And the second one, in the bottom right image, is adding information about the plants, adding information about what we do with nature-based solutions is really, really important because it engages people. It makes them feel like they're part of that space. And everything that we do at Biotecture, I always want to have some sort of an info board about why did we do this? What's the benefit of it? And maybe some information about the plants. We do some work with some health companies, and within their spaces, we can then pick out particular plants that are used in medicine and call out that medicine. Within this environment in Heathrow, we're picking out plants and then we're saying, where in the world have they come from? Which is always of interest. And so just before I show you the positive stats that come from this, I'm just going to play you the quick 2-minute video, and then we're pretty close to wrapping up and for questions. So this is our nursery space in West Sussex where we pre-grow the plants. And there's a bit of time-lapse photography which just shows these plants just growing on. And the reason we grow in a nursery, 2 reasons. One is we want to get good root establishment before they go into aggressive locations like indoor spaces or 30 meters up on buildings. And the second reason is because there's no second chance to make a first impression. And so we want that wow factor to come in immediately when we put some green infrastructure into spaces. Then in this instance, you can see the bare walls of gate 25, and we're just really putting in some mobile units. There's no access to water in these locations. I think we work with the art of the possible, meeting the constraints of the practical. And then this is a departure gate. This was back in 2016. This is American Airlines departure gate. 257,000 people fly through this gate every year. And so it's impacting a lot of people in terms of how that effect goes on. And so what the results of that survey were, there's a happy face, sad face machine that they have in this space. And in the 3 months prior to this, the living wall being installed, 42% of people, 47% of people were very positive or positive about the space. After the green wall gets installed, that 47% becomes 72%. It's a really significant increase, very positive, increases by a third, but from 28% by 30% to 58%. We were on our third install with Heathrow Airport when the pandemic broke, because they recognise the value of creating spaces that are better for people. It's a really big study, this one as well, because of the fact that during that 6-month period when this data was collected, probably 125,000 people flew out of that gate. So this for us is a really good indicator of the value of bringing plants into spaces from a people point of view. So really where we capture it is we talk about making spaces better naturally. I would go back to talk about the fact that in 2050, 80% of the building stock that will exist then already exists now. So we need to make those spaces better now. By enriching spaces, we can be good on for our place in the environment. We can provide people with that enrichment of space and place to make them feel more empowered. And in doing all of this, we're creating spaces where businesses can flourish, whether that's external public realm spaces or whether that's inside offices. And so we look at these multiple benefits from something as complex as nature to try to combat some of the complex issues that are here with the climate emergency that we have now. And so when we start, and for me, again, it's all about the positive. Sustainability practices are all about how we reduce our impacts. This for me is about how we can increase our impacts on the environment that's around us. So even when we talk about that one return on investment of reduced absenteeism, I'm actually going to change that going forwards to increase presenteeism, because I think it's really important that we use the power of nature to bring positive results in each of those spheres. So that's the end of this presentation today on making spaces better naturally. I would really encourage you to think about your places and spaces that you have, and also that no place is too small to start having green infrastructure. And one of the things that we've got very good at Biotecture over the last 15, 16 years is to understand where the best locations are to put green infrastructure. And getting involved at an early stage really allows us to maximize benefits and therefore maximize value and return on investment for our clients. There's a couple of clients we work with in that way, and we'd love to work with more clients because we're just passionate about the power of plants and how we can harness them to make our spaces better naturally. So, Jess, a slightly interrupted session this time. Do we have any questions?
We do. Thanks, Richard. So firstly, one from Marie has asked how the parklets fare in areas which are often subject to vandalism.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think there are challenges in certain areas. We've always found, a bit like the broken window syndrome, that if you start to increase the value of an area, that actually acts of vandalism start to decrease. We've noticed that with our living walls, where we put living walls into places and spaces, and people have been concerned about the living walls being vandalised. And we haven't really seen that at all. The only time it starts to come into play, we had a project in Grimsby, and the local authority changed hands at an election. This is a long time ago, back 2012, 2013, something like that. The local authority changed hands and no longer came up with the budget for maintenance. And as the living wall started to show obvious signs of decay because plants do need maintenance, then people started coming in and doing some extra damage to it. So it's all about proactively looking after those assets from a maintenance point of view. It's also about choosing the right places and spaces within which to do these things. Yeah.
Another question is, how do we overcome the issue of fire safety when using living walls indoors?
Yeah, so living walls indoors can be thought of in a couple of different ways. If we think of them as wall linings, i.e. basically part of the fabric of the building or large enough to be such, then we need to be thinking about making sure that we have some sort of comfort from a fire safety point of view, some sort of energy assessment with regards to engineering assessment with regards to reaction to fire that can prove and show that we can achieve the ratings that are required, which are generally a B rated. And again, going back to some of our work in Heathrow, we're putting living walls into actually the tunnels that go out to the aircraft with B-rated materials. But in most instances, when you're indoors, when you've got smaller scale installations, the living walls are now attachments, or they're adornments, or they are art, if you like. And as such, they're smaller scale, and they're not going to add to that fire risk that a wall lining would do.
Okay, and how much maintenance is involved with these living walls once they're installed, and what are the costs involved?
Right. So maintenance is an interesting question, and obviously it depends on a number of factors, particularly size and location, and access. A lot of the stuff we're talking about here is more ground level than some of the building cladding systems, where you might have access equipment that you need to provide in terms of scissor lifts or even building management units or whatever that might be. From our point of view, you know, it's really difficult to give an answer on how much does maintenance cost. We like to think of it as what value we bring by what we're installing. So we appreciate that anything that we do that changes an existing environment adds a cost in and adds a maintenance budget into something where there previously wasn't a maintenance budget. But the reason we're doing it is because it adds value. So focusing on thinking about what we're doing with the green infrastructure as an asset to be nurtured rather than necessarily a liability to be maintained, it is a way that we are thinking about that with our clients. So what value are we bringing with that nature-based solution? The cost question is really valid, and in each instance we can talk about cost and how much it would cost, but our belief is that the value benefit of doing so is something that is compelling.
We're coming up to 3 o'clock now, so I've just got one more question from Victoria,
Yes.
who has asked about in indoor office spaces, how do you deal with the potential problem of allergies? Are there any
Yes.
options for low pollen plants?
Yes, and we wouldn't use high pollen plants in allergy situations. We work in some hospitals, not in clinical spaces, but in non-clinical spaces, and in those spaces we have a palette of plants that we use that have been signed off by clinicians as being non-allergenic, whatever the right word is, but they don't add to allergies of a particular type. So yeah, it's just getting rid of those pollen-free ones. Yeah.
Thanks, Richard.